Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about the Spanish-American War. So we are still in Unit 3, Notes number 2. Cubans rebel against Spain. The United States had long held an interest in Cuba. Cuba is only about 90 miles off the coast of Florida, so because it is so close, there's always this interest of wanting Cuba as a territory, as a colony. However, Cuba was a colony of Spain. So the U.S. had offered to buy it from Spain in 1854, but Spain refused. So the Cuban people wanted to be independent. They did not want to be under the control of Spain. So we began to see anti-Spanish sentiment in Cuba erupt into a war for independence. Jose Marti, a Cuban exile in New York, organized Cuban resistance against Spain using an active guerrilla campaign and deliberately destroying property, American owned sugar mills. So his reason for doing this is that he wanted to provoke the United States. He wanted the US to intervene and to help the rebels achieve independence. Public opinion in the US at the time was split in terms of if we should support the Cuban Rebellion or if we should stay out of it, or support Spain. Many business people wanted the government to support Spain in order to protect their investment, their sugarcane farms on sugarcane plantations on Cuba. Others were sympathetic to the rebels, the Cuban rebels, because it was so similar to the U.S. fight for independence against Great Britain. So the idea that we should also assist a country in gaining their independence because we were able to accomplish that goal. War fever escalates. So to lure readers, William Randolph Hearst, his newspaper was called the New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper, the New York World, printed exaggerated accounts of the Cuban Rebellion. And so they wanted to sell newspapers. So they wanted these bold headlines. They wanted these graphic images to describe what the rebellion was happening. Sometimes they didn't always report the accurate truth, so almost maybe more tabloid style reporting. And so this sensational style of writing became known as yellow journalism. And so Hearst and Pulitzer both fanned war fever. They knew that if the U.S. got involved in a war, they would have stories to report on, they could sell more newspapers. So they're looking at this purely as a profit-motivated stance. So a quote from Hearst was, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." So he had sent an illustrator out to Cuba to draw images for him to use in the newspaper. And if he felt if he could convince public opinion to change, then the U.S. could go to war. So the DeLome letter. When President McKinley took office in 1898, demands for American intervention grew. McKinley preferred to avoid war with Spain and tried diplomatic means to resolve the crisis. So from McKinley's point of view, this is the Cuban issue, doesn't feel that America should get involved. However, in February of 1898, the New York Journal published a private letter from the Spanish minister where he called McKinley weak and a bidder for admiration from the crowd. And this became known as the DeLome letter. So this is published. The American public is reading this. They see this as an insult from the Spanish minister. So people are furious. They are calling for war with Spain. However, just the headlines and this insult isn't enough for us to declare war. The USS Maine explodes. Early in 1898, President McKinley had ordered the USS Maine to Cuba to bring home American citizens in danger from the fighting and to protect American property. However, on February 15th, the ship blew up in the Havana harbor. No one knew why the ship exploded. In the explosion, 260 men were killed. And so American newspapers began to report that the Spanish was responsible. So this is now viewed as a direct attack against the U.S. It changes people's opinion in terms of our stance in the war. We feel that we are now being dragged in. And so people are assuming that Spain is responsible. However, we learned later on that the explosion was actually caused by the broiler, I believe, within the ship. So Spain didn't actually cause it. But again, this was learned much later. So let's stop and think. Why was the US reluctant to get involved in the Cuban Rebellion? So initially, we do not view this as our own crisis. We try to kind of stay out of other people's issues. But little by little, we begin to get drawn into the conflict of what is happening with Cuba. War with Spain erupts. So remember, the Maine became the rallying cry for U.S. intervention in Cuba. Despite Spanish concessions, public opinion favored the war. On April 11, 1898, McKinley asked Congress to declare war on Spain, officially starting the Spanish-American War. The Spanish thought that the U.S. would invade Cuba, but the first attack came on the Spanish colony of the Philippines. So for the U.S., we feel like if we're going to have a war with Spain, then let's go after kind of multiple of their colonies. So American Commodore George Dewey gave the command to open fire on the Spanish fleet at Manila in the Philippines. Within hours, Dewey's men had destroyed every Spanish ship there. And so we're using our new, if you remember back for the notes from earlier in the week, our new naval fleet that's made out of steel, where the Spanish ships are still made out of wood. So they stood no chance whatsoever to our new naval fleet. Dewey had the support of the Filipinos, who, like the Cubans, also wanted freedom from Spain. Over the next 2 months, 11,000 Americans joined forces with the Filipino rebels and forced a Spanish surrender in August. So right now, the U.S. is basically fighting a two-front war, meaning they're fighting Spain in two different places. We just talked about the war in the Philippines, so the war in Manila. And so from April to May were basically the major battles. Now we're going to talk about the war in the Caribbean around Cuba, where the initial conflict was. So we have to kind of split our forces when you're fighting a two-front war. So in the Caribbean, the American admiral created a naval blockade of the Spanish fleet. So you can see the blockade pictured here. Dewey's victory at Manila demonstrated the superiority of the U.S. naval forces. However, our army was primarily made up of volunteer troops. So our army not as well trained. We didn't have enough modern guns to go around. So American forces landed in Cuba in June 1898 with about 17,000 troops. The Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were a volunteer cavalry under the command of Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt. So before Theodore Roosevelt became vice president and then president, he was, I believe, the assistant secretary to the Navy. So he left that post to volunteer and go and fight in the war. The most famous land battle in Cuba featured the Rough Riders leading a dramatic uphill charge. This cleared the way for the victory at San Juan Hill. 2 days later, the Spanish tried to escape the American blockade. On the heels of victory, the American troops also invaded Puerto Rico on July 25th. So let's stop and think. Why was the United States able to have such an easy victory over Spain? So the obvious answer is our superior Navy. So the fact that we had this modern Navy made out of steel, it could withstand a lot more of the fighting than the wooden ships that the Spanish had. And so overall, just the sheer force of our military was easy to overpower the Spanish. And the fighting only lasted a few months. It was not a long war at all. Treaty of Paris. The United States and Spain signed an armistice ceasefire agreement on August 12, 1898, ending the Spanish-American War. The U.S. and Spain met in Paris to agree on a treaty. Spain agreed to free Cuba, turn over the islands of Guam and Puerto Rico to the U.S., and they also sold the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. The Treaty of Paris set a debate in the U.S. about whether or not the U.S. had the right to annex the Philippines. Because if you remember, when the Filipinos joined in the fighting, they also wanted independence. They weren't looking to replace one ruler with another, to replace Spain with the US. On February 6, 1899, the annexation question was settled with the Senate's approval of the Treaty of Paris. So the US now had an empire that included Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So let's stop and think. How did the Spanish-American War change the role of the US? So the fact that the US defeated Spain, a very established European power, so quickly, so swiftly, and easily really propels the US to kind of a greater world power, greater status. You see this image here, this political cartoon of Uncle Sam kind of riding on the world. And so we start to have these new territories, not just within our country, but outside. It demonstrates our military strength. So it really does start to change the US into a world power. So we are done with these notes. Make sure you go back and look at your key terms.